let's talk about that gospel. Wow, what a story, right? Especially coming like just 2 weeks after we celebrated the nativity of John, our patron saint, and all that wonderful feel-goodness about that story. And today we get this. And I really don't think that there's any other gospel proclamation in the liturgical cycle like this gospel. I mean, even on Good Friday, when we hear the entire Passion narrative, it always ends with the narrator giving some kind of context. All these things happened to fulfill the scripture which says they shall look on him whom they have pierced. So it sort of gives us a, okay, it was gruesome, it was awful, but I see there's some context for this. Today's gospel, not so much. We are left with a young girl holding the severed head of John the Baptist on a platter, giving it to her mother, and then his disciples secretly coming to bury him. It's very disturbing, and it's also very riveting. In fact, it's partly responsible for our music director, Scott, and I to write a musical about our patron saint. I've told this story, but a number of years ago when he suggested, why don't we write our own musical? And I laughed. And a little bit later in the evening, he goes, no, seriously, if we were to write a musical, what would it be about? And I stopped and I thought, well, you don't get much better material than our patron saint. A miraculous birth, old people that are giving birth, and then you've got this crazily dressed guy out in the desert yelling at people, and it ends with this royal banquet with intrigue and betrayal and a dancing girl and a beheading. What more could a show ask for? And it's, I'm not the only one, because that's why there have been all these representations of this very story, both in opera, Salome, Strauss, and many cinematic productions. And, it's made for Hollywood, and I guess opera too, because they love pomp and regal, royalty, and they love blood and gore and betrayal. It's all there. But I think that the reason that this story has captivated people for millennia now goes beyond those big things of gore and intrigue and sex. Hollywood always has to put sex in. I think opera does too. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think at its core, this story is so riveting because it's much deeper than that. And it has these incredible psychological entanglements. When you hear that story, there are a number of ways to approach it, but let's just look at it from the angle of power. It's really a story about power, isn't it? And you've got Herod, King Herod. He really wasn't the king, but he was called King Herod. He was the absolute ruler of the area. He had total power. And then you've got this crazy prophet, John the Baptist, out of the wilderness. And Herod is attracted to him, and people both then and now scratch their heads. He certainly didn't try to model his life after John's teaching of social justice, and if you have 2 coats, share with someone who has none, and likewise with your food. That couldn't have interested Herod at all. And not only that, John publicly berated Herod for stealing his brother's wife. Herodias was married to his brother. Well, history argues about whether it was Philip or another one of his brothers. And Herod just took her, along with her daughter Salome. And John says, that's not right. That's wrong. He called him out in public on that, and that's what landed him in the slammer. You don't do that to the king. But yet Herod was still sort of under his spell. John had this power over Herod. Then we've got the young Salome, and that's where opera and cinema love to you have to find somewhere to put in the romantic tension. So a lot of them portray Salome as secretly in love with this desert character, and she realizes she can't have him. So if she can't have him, she's going to get him one way or the other, and it's going to be dead. And I keep picturing Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard with the severed head going, she kisses his lips, she kisses his lips. Bizarre. It's not in the biblical story. And in the musical we're writing, actually, we portray her at least closer to that image of being just a typical teenage girl. Typically sort of self-centered, but naive, and very malleable. But she has power over her stepdad because she does this dance, this amazing dance, and he's ready to give her half of his kingdom. That's a lot of power. And then we've got Herodias, her mother. Talk about power. It's all in manipulation. She has total power over her daughter. And what happens in the story is when Herod promises to give Salome anything, she goes to her mother and asks her, what should I ask for? And then she has her own teenage girl things. Maybe I should ask for one big shopping spree, a day to buy and buy from Harrods on to Saks and then go back. No price too high. But her mother's very manipulative. And she's like, oh, honey, you could get that any time from Herod. You need to take this moment to ask for something really important that the opportunity may never arise again. And she's like, oh, maybe I should ask for the guy of my dreams who's super rich, an actor or a jock who's super hot, my perfect hitch. And she's like, honey, yeah, but let's be honest, that won't last. And then she very subtly mentions herself with her daughter. She says, well, think about when you're grown up. What's going to bring us happiness? Us, not Solomon. And then the daughter takes that bait and says, well, maybe I should ask for our own company, a business to run with you and me on top. A daughter and her mother, that couldn't flop. And then Herodias knows she's got her. And she's like, oh, you're thinking of your mother, you sweet child. Okay, well, if you really want to know what would make me happy, let me tell you. And of course, she asked for the head of John the Baptist because Herodias can't stand John. You may think, well, he's saying that she shouldn't have been stolen from her husband. The gig with Herod was much better than her husband. He was King Herod. She wanted to make sure that marriage lasted. And John went from preaching to meddling. So she's not only controlling her daughter, she's controlling her husband, Herod, because she knows he's made this promise in front of all of his guests. And here's another psychological entanglement. He could put any of those guests to death in an instant. And yet he's afraid of them because he doesn't want to be embarrassed of having made this big proclamation and promise to his stepdaughter and then not carry through on it. Would they think he's not a man, that he's weak? And so you've got it's a wonderful, I think there's a doctoral dissertation there about power. But I don't think that's why we hear this gospel proclaimed on a Sunday morning. It's not because of the glitzy pomp and circumstance and gore, and it's not because of the psychological study of what's going on there. The reason we hear it proclaimed is the same reason we hear any gospel proclaimed. It's to invite us in to salvation history, to invite us in to the sacred story, to see our place in it and to claim it. And there are many avenues to do that, but I think one of the most obvious is through the character of Salome. Because let's face it, we have all been dancing a dance for the king. Since the day we were born, our whole lives are our performance for the king, who not only gives a banquet, gives banquets continually. Every week we attend the banquet of the king, either virtually or here in person. And yes, we offer our financial gifts, which are so important and keep the church running and so forth. But what moves God is the offering of our dance, the offering of our lives with all of its beauty and grace and all of the missteps and total disasters. It's not that God approves of every step we've ever taken, but God is deeply moved by the offering of our dance, of our life, and wants to shower us with blessing. And here we find ourselves confronted with the same wonderment as Salome. What should I ask for? We may find ourselves tempted by the same temptations she was, which, by the way, are the exact same temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. We might be tempted to ask for material wealth and ease, for one big shopping spree, a day to buy and buy, or in Jesus' case, to make these stones into bread. We might be tempted to ask for emotional fulfillment, the guy of my dreams, the perfect hitch, or in Jesus' case, the temptation to jump from the parapet of the temple to prove God's love was so great as to send angels to hold him up. Or we may be tempted to ask for power and success, a business where we're on top and it can't flop. Or for Jesus in the wilderness to fall down before Satan in order to gain all the kingdoms of the world. These are perennial temptations everyone faces. Salome looks and listens for the voice of her mother for advice, which we would probably agree wasn't a good idea. And it's a good reminder to us that it's not always our nearest and dearest that we need to listen to the voice. Sometimes we need to listen to the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, on the edges of society, to make the dream of God a reality. Sometimes we need to listen to the voice of one who's been locked up but can't be shut up, that wants to bring that dream into reality. Because the truth and the good news of this whole story of John is that, yes, he's the voice of one in the wilderness, but we are all the voice of one. And that, in fact, is the point of the whole musical that you will one day you'll see it, I guarantee you. It's we each have been given a voice by God. It's unique to us. And it is our vocation to find how to use that. Now, we might not be a prophet or the child of a prophet, like Amos said. I'm not one of those. We may not be a tour de force like John the Baptist. We may not be a visionary like Martin Luther King Jr. But we can all take steps, and we can all learn to use that voice for good. It doesn't matter if we've never done it before. It's never too late. In fact, in the last scene of the show, Salome begins to find her voice and differentiate from her mother. We are promised blessings without measure. And we are promised, in the words that John's father sang a few weeks ago when we remembered his birth, Zechariah singing the Benedictus. If we use that voice, we are promised a song whose music is stronger than death. That's the good news that's proclaimed in this horrific, ghastly story. The King is moved by our dancing and wants to shower us with blessing, and is promising us a song whose music is stronger than death. Our question is, what should we ask for? Amen.